Hi there, my name is Miloš Viktorović and I'm one of the lecturers of the Smart Urban Environments course. As a part of this course, I'll be teaching you module ICT and IoT within Smart Urban Environments. And for that module, you also have the assignment that is based on Student IoT Kit. Through this video, I'll give you more information about the kit itself, how can you assemble it, and how can you use it. So therefore, let's start with the unboxing.
Let's continue.
Okay, let us start with unboxing. This is how the kit that you'll get looks like. So, typical plastic box. What is the most important is that in each kit you have this kind of paper which states what is in the given kit. Of course, you will need a Raspberry Pi, GrovePi, different sensors, different cables, power bank as well, and SD card. So it is important that once you get the kit, you check based on this paper if all the components are there. So let's start by unpacking everything. So you'll have Ethernet cable, typical Ethernet to Internet connection. Here we already have some things connected. We'll leave that for later. Typical USB cable. From one side standard USB, from the other one USB-C. This is the cable you'll use for powering your Raspberry Pi. Here you can see GrovePi rotary angle sensor. As you can see inside there are also information about the sensor, like to which port it should be connected, what kind of characteristics of the signals it have, etc, etc. Similarly, we have the sound sensor, air quality sensor, temperature and humidity sensor, dust sensor or particulate matter sensor, and this is the package from the OLED display that you see connected already here. Let's go through these ones. Here you have adapter, USB to Ethernet, so this will make your connection to your computer much easier, simply in case you don't have the Ethernet port, or you'll see later in the tutorials how this can make connection easier. And here, as you can see, you have the power bank in case you want to use your Raspberry Pi outside where you don't have the power source. You can use this one. What is important here to note is that this power bank has two outputs, and it is really important that you plug in your Raspberry Pi into the correct one. And you'll see here in the indication that output USB 1 provides 5 volts and 1 amp, and USB 2, 5 volts and 2.4 amps of DC current. It is important that you use USB 2 because Raspberry Pi requires at least 2 amps to function. And of course, last but the most important part, here is already pre-connected from your colleagues from last year. You can see from one side Raspberry Pi. On top of it, you can see the GrovePi Plus, which already has the OLED display attached. And here is the SD card already plugged into the Raspberry Pi. So that would be it for the first part. Now we can look a bit more into the details of Raspberry Pi and GrovePi Plus. So therefore we'll need only this part. I'll disconnect the display for now. And as I already mentioned, what you can see here on top is GrovePi Plus. I'll disconnect them to demonstrate. So this is Raspberry Pi. This model is 4B with 2 GB of RAM. What is important to note that all the ports it has. So from this side, you can see going from right to left, the Ethernet port. Then you have two USB 3.0 ports, and on the left you have two USB 2.0 ports. What is the main difference is that blue ports are USB 3 ports, which allow for much faster data transfer. From this side, going from left to right, the first one you can see is a USB-C port that is used to power Raspberry Pi. Then you have two micro HDMI ports used to connect your Raspberry Pi to the monitor if you have the proper cable. This is AV port that we will not be using in this kit. So therefore I won't go into details of that, but you can always find the Raspberry Pi documentation with much more explanations. Here we have two other ports that we are again not using, so I will not go into depth into them. So from this side and from below, you can see the slot for micro SD card, which here serves as basically a hard drive in your computer. So all the data is stored here, including your operating system. So without this SD card, the Raspberry Pi cannot function. And for the last, you see a lot of pins here. You can go into the documentation of Raspberry Pi to see what each pin represents, but the main idea is that these are GPIO pins, general purpose input-output pins, which are used to interconnect peripherals and devices on top of the Raspberry Pi. So what you can do is directly to certain pins connect certain devices like sensors, etc., etc. But in order to make our lives easier, we use different kind of extension or hats. So this kind of extension is called GrovePi Plus. As you can see here, it connects nicely to the Raspberry Pi. And what is important is that in your kit, you'll get this already connected all together. So there is no need to separate them and connect them again. Also, be careful that you don't scratch yourself on this kind of pins. But going back to GrovePi Plus, is the additional board provided by Dexter Industries. And the whole idea behind this board is to enable us to quickly and easily attach additional peripherals like sensors, displays, and other devices. And this can be achieved through these ports here all around, and in the schematics you can see that there are different kind of ports here, and if you zoom in a bit you should be able to see different notations for each ports. So we have 4 types of ports on these boards. So we have analog ports, these 3, they're marked by A1, A0 and A2, and the other ports are digital ones. You can see them marked as with the letter D, so D2, D3, D4 up to D8. You have also serial ports, and you have I2C ports marked here with I2C 1 to I2C 3. So this is really important when you're connecting your devices, that you make sure that you connect the device to the proper port. If you're not sure which device should be connected to which port, you can always go to the documentation on the web page of Grove products, and you can see to which port it should be connected. It's easy to mistake in them because, as you can see, these connection cables are all the same. So no matter which port you use, connection cable is the same. How the connection cable works is that you simply plug one side to your peripheral device and the other one to the appropriate port. If you go a bit into the documentation, you will see that this kind of display should be connected to I2C port on the GrovePi Plus board. But if you see the specific documentation for this kit, I believe it is also noted on this paper. Yes, this display should be connected to I2C /2 port simply because there is already pre-programmed software running on this Raspberry Pi that will allow you to see some information on the display from the start. So we need to identify where is this I2C 2 port. As you can see, that's this one. We simply plug in and that's it. So connection is as simple as that. What is important to note here is the safety when you're handling this kind of devices. Make sure that they're unplugged when you're switching on or switching off and connecting and disconnecting other things. Also pay attention that you might allow these devices to touch other circuits, therefore creating a short circuit and therefore creating not safe environment. Something can burn on the board, but more dangerously, you can hurt yourself. So please keep these devices separately. One also safety concern is the heating of Raspberry Pi board. So you can see all the chips in between. They can get quite warm, so be careful when you're touching the Raspberry Pi that you don't burn yourself. That being said, okay, the next step that we are going to do is actually plug in the Raspberry Pi to the power so we can test if it works. That is also the reason why we connected the display first, because display will indicate us whether the Raspberry Pi is working correctly. So in order to repeat the steps, just quickly, so this bundle you'll get connected, make sure that micro SD card is in there, connect the display, make sure the display is not touching the circuits, and here I brought the fully charged power bank. As you can see, 4 dots, that means fully charged, and I have here the cable that is provided in the kit. What I'll do next is that I will plug the cable into the port. I will also make sure that this display stays clear from the circuits on the Raspberry Pi. And as I mentioned before, it is important to plug it into USB 2 because that is the one that gives 2.4 amps and we need at least 2 for running the Raspberry Pi. Plugging in is as simple as that. And with this power bank, you need actually to press the power button in order to start the current flow. So as you can see, you already have indications on the Raspberry Pi that is being powered up. Green light shows that it is actually doing some processing. And you also see on the GrovePi Plus, there are 2 lights that are indicating that the board is working. So now, especially the first time, this takes some time to boot up, but now it's already connected, and you'll see here the information on the display says IP not assigned. That is a good sign because that means that script that is checking whether the Raspberry Pi is connected to your laptop is working correctly, and as it is not, therefore IP cannot be assigned, and this is exactly the reason why you're getting this message. So next steps, in order to connect it to your laptop, you will need the Ethernet cable. So Ethernet cable is a standard network cable that you will connect to your Raspberry Pi. This is simply done. Just make it click. Now you should be able to see it clearly. How do you take out the cable? Is that you press here and slightly pull, and the cable goes out. So once more, simple plugging in, making sure that it's standing correctly. And that is it. That is the first step. From the other side, you will have this adapter, just to make your life a bit easier so that you do not have to reconfigure the Ethernet port on your laptop, but you can reconfigure this one. And also, in case you do not have the Ethernet port on your laptop, you can use this one because most probably you have the USB port. Very simple, is that cable goes into the adapter and you have the adapter. You just need to plug it into your laptop. But we'll leave that for later. We can explore a bit more sensors and how you can connect them. So here I took already some open sensors so that I do not have to unpack the new ones. And you can see, of course, the most simplest sensor is a rotary angle sensor. In all packages, you'll have the cable and the sensor. Also, in the original packages, you'll have a documentation which states how is this sensor powered, what does it basically do, and also what kind of interface it has. So here it's clearly written that it goes to the analog port. It measures the angle between 0 and 300 degrees, which basically in resistance value that means from 0 to 10,000 ohms. As you can see, sensor is nothing more than a rotating switch that, as I already mentioned, measures from 0 to 300 degrees. And it's connected to analog port. How is it connected? You have the cable. One side of the cable you plug in to the sensor, the other side to the analog port. We already mentioned, and you can see in the documentation, that analog ports are these ones here, but it's also noted on the board here from A0 to A2, so we can plug it into, for now, just for the demonstration purposes, into A2, A0, and we have the sensor connected. Now changing this sensor will not indicate anything because we do not have software that is providing reading from this specific sensor. So therefore, that's your part of the assignment, is to write that piece of code that will read the value of the analog port and recalculate what does that value actually mean in terms of degrees of rotation. Also, one more interesting sensor is the temperature and humidity sensor, and it's actually a bundle of two sensors, one measuring temperature and one measuring relative humidity of the air around the sensor. So what is interesting is this error in the documentation where it states that this sensor needs to be connected to the analog port. But this is not correct, so pay attention to this. Also, we have here in this paper that you get with the kit, it's noted down the temperature and humidity sensor should be connected to the D port, meaning digital port, and you can choose which digital port actually it is. You'll notice something similar with the dust and particulate sensor, which is a very complex sensor, and the library that you use to access the sensor information in your code is actually written in such a way that it allows for this sensor to be only connected to port D2. So pay attention to that when you decide to connect your sensors. But as we already mentioned, this sensor measures both temperature and humidity, and it's connected to the digital port. Now, for the sake of practice, I will connect it to any of the digital ports. As you can see here, we have serial ports, so not those ones. We have port D2, D3, and D4, so these are all digital ports, but we also have D5, D6, D7, and D8. So these are all digital ports we can plug in into any of these. Just for the sake of practice, I'll plug it into D3. As you can see, display is still showing IP not assigned message, which is a good message because still this network is not plugged in.